Hello, I'm Pika, and welcome back. With the recent slow but steady release of information about Splatoon 3, we've been seeing various reworks to existing weapons. Many weapons have received visual polishing or complete overhauls, and new features like the marker sub weapon and most specials seem like functional reworks of past subs and specials. People come rushing in with their takes on new designs and potential changes every time we see one, and each reveal checks another weapon off the list of ones we're still in anticipation of seeing. At the time of me recording this, we've seen designs for 4 out of the 5 sloshers. Sloshing Machine was shown in the first gameplay reveal, Slosher was in the release date trailer, and both Tri-Slosher and Explosher were shown on Twitter recently. All of them have had some kind of graphical updates, with Tri-Slosher looking completely different. We don't know much about if these weapons will work any differently though. Slosher looks like its hitboxes might be a bit more uniform instead of being so front heavy, but that's just a guess based on what we've seen. Anyway, we're still missing one Slosher, and it's one that many players have strong feelings about one way or another, the Bloblobber. So this begs the question. Is Bloblobber just being held for hype purposes later on, or have we not seen it yet because its reveal will be something more substantial? Now, we know for sure that Blob will be returning in some form, since Nintendo said every main weapon is coming back. I'm also honestly expecting some kind of model update to Blob since every other slosher has seen some changes to theirs, most of them being pretty drastic. What I'm most interested in though is any potential changes to how the weapon will function. We've seen weapon reworks between games before, like how the dual sculpture from Splatoon 1 got turned into a dually, and how rollers gained vertical swings and chargers got stored charges in the transition between games. Acknowledging the potential for a weapon rework isn't very extreme, and Blob seems like a prime candidate to receive one. Like I said before, Blob is very divisive. Some players like myself love it in all its unique qualities, while many other players find it obnoxious or lame, and I have to admit I can see what they mean in some ways. Blob's overall design also might clash with the more flashy and fast-paced vibe that the devs seem to be going for with Splatoon 3. But how could Blob be reworked to potentially fit in better while still maintaining its own identity and charm? I'm sure there's plenty of ways, and I've got an idea of my own. As a very simple recap of how the weapon works, Bloblobber shoots volleys of 4 blobs that each deal 30 damage and bounce off any surface twice before they expire. Anyone who's watched my blob guide might remember that there are very slight differences between the first blob and the rest of the volleys though. You should totally watch that video if you haven't, by the way, I swear I'm not biased. Anyway, Blob's leading shot has slightly higher velocity and a slightly larger hitbox than the rest of the blobs, as if it's intended to be the easiest one to deal damage with. I like this feature of Blob a lot, and my idea for a rework is actually centered around taking this concept and scaling it to the extreme. I think that the leading blob should be buffed to make it Blob's main killing option, but at the cost of reworking the other blobs too to balance it out. I think it'd be easier to say how I would change Blob's stats and properties first, then explain why I think it'd be a healthy change for the game. I'll start with the changes I'd make to the leading blob. They might sound extreme, but wait to hear the other changes too. Like I said, I want to expand upon the idea of the first blob being better for dealing damage. It currently does 30 damage like the rest of the blobs, and I'd like to see it increase to 60. The hitbox in the first blob has a radius of 8, which for reference is the same size as the forward slosh from a Tri-Slosher. I want to see a very slight increase to that as well, perhaps to a radius of just 9 or 10. Blob also has the slowest projectile velocity of any main weapon in the game, at just above 5. I again want to see just a slight increase here. I think the speed of a Luna Blaster shot, which is still on the very low end of about 8, sounds about right. Lastly, for buffs, I think the leading blob should also gain a third bounce. Again, I know this sounds like a lot, but let's get to the trailing blobs now. For these, I'm essentially changing all the same stats except as nerfs this time. First, for this rework idea, I think all the other blobs should do 20 damage instead of 30. I also think their hitbox sizes and shot velocity should be slightly reduced. And by reversing all the previous changes, I mean it. I think these blobs should actually lose a bounce too, and only have 1 instead of 2. To wrap up these changes, there's one other quality of Blob I want to reverse. Currently, Blob only paints where its shots hit the ground or a wall, with one exception. Blob's leading shot has a paint trail underneath it that goes up to a set distance away from the player, and I think that should instead be a quality of the trailing blobs. By the way, any stats I did not mention are not changed with this idea, so things like fire rate and ink consumption would stay more or less the same. Alright, finally, let me explain. The core idea of these changes is to make Blob's leading shot be the embodiment of the weapon's strengths and quirks, and become a reliable tool for dealing damage. With this change comes the trade-off of making the other blobs weaker at killing, especially at a far distance. By giving them paint trails and by slowing their travel speed, however, they instead become great tools for maintaining a more limited but consistent and thorough area of control directly around the blob user. As a blob player, and a very aggressive one at that, the idea of having a more flexible and reliable killing option is super exciting. Playing around the bouncing mechanic to find off-angle shots on my enemies is what makes the weapon so fun. and having a faster blob with a third bounce opens up so many opportunities. It would make them easier to capitalize on. By only letting the first blob make use of this though, it should be fair since I can't just one burst someone who's hiding behind cover halfway across the map. They'll be able to see 2 separate shots flying in their direction, and should have time to react. Having the trailing blobs reworked too isn't actually as big of a nerf as it might seem. One of my main frustrations with Blob sometimes is how it has a hard time painting for itself to move around. Sure, Blob puts insane amounts of paint out in general, but there usually isn't very thorough paint that the Blob can directly play off of, so the weapon can be rushed down and overwhelmed pretty easily. Increasing the painting power of the trailing blobs lets Blob cover itself much better up close, but without a second bounce, these blobs also won't be able to travel far enough to abuse that painting power for plays outside of its original intention. Also, as for the damage changes, having the lead blob deal 60 damage keeps Bloblobber in line with the other sloshers for having a rather reliable 2-slosh kill. With the restrictions on the trailing blobs, you only get to secure 1 burst kills on enemies that are very close to you. Reducing the other blob damage down to 20 also makes it to where 1 full slosh still deals 120 damage altogether, which is exactly what it is currently. In my opinion, these also fix some of the major complaints by people who have to fight against Blob. The 2 things I hear most often are that Bloblobber is too strong at spamming paint and specials from a safe distance, and that the threat of 1-burst kills at long range can be oppressive. By decreasing the leading blob's paint output by removing its trail, Bloblobber will be far worse at spamming paint safely. With these changes, Blob's main paint influence will be far closer to itself, so he'll have to move up more to really have the same impact, and at the same time become more vulnerable. Also, while Blob still keeps the potential to 1-burst opponents up close, the long-range insta-kills won't be an issue if the secondary blobs can't travel that far to begin with. By making Blob harder to play safe and spammy with, it'll be forced to participate more in the chaos of a match. But with better paint for movement and more flexible killing power, it'll also feel much more at home in that fast-paced and aggressive environment. This just feels like a fun change for both Blob players and their opponents, and it goes with the apparent vibe of Splatoon 3's design so far when compared to 2. All the while, Blob doesn't lose its core gimmick or feeling, keeping the identity of a weapon that so many people love alive. That's all for my Blob rework idea. How would you feel if these ended up being real in Splatoon 3? Is there any other rework ideas you have for Blob or any other weapon? Let me know down below. Also, just to clarify, I'm not expecting anything close to these changes to actually happen in Splatoon 3, and even if Blob is not changed at all, I'll definitely still be playing it. I fell in love with how it is currently, so I know I'll make it work no matter what. Or maybe the devs will just go wild and they'll turn Blob into a bow or something, who really knows. This is just a fun theory and thought experiment as to what could technically be possible with a new game. Anyway, thanks for watching, and have a good one.